So the first of all, I guess I should say that, really, really happy to be here. And thank you, Dominique, for inviting me and for organizing this excellent seminar. I've been here once before in 2014. It was a great pleasure. And as I'm finishing work on a book on Russia versus Europe and the lands in between, I thought it would be really important for me to come and get the feedback of this Ukrainianist community to, on the book and on this project, and to learn a lot from the seminar. I look forward to that. So the first thing I think I already mentioned, that this chapter that you've read, or paper that you've read, is a chapter of a book that is now under review, very recently under review. It's called Russia versus Europe and the Lands in Between. Many of you may know me as a political economist of the region and of Russian and East European Studies. I'm also professor of Russian and East European Studies at Penn and chair of that department there. This is my first foray into foreign policy. I've been studying, however, foreign policy for about 10 years. And this is just happens to be my first book. I've written a lot of articles you may have seen in Foreign Affairs before that, but those are very short. So this book is, I thought I would just situate the chapter within the book very briefly. The first part of the book looks at the emerging conflict between Russia and Europe. I focus on the EU in particular. And the second part of the book looks at how this conflict between Russia and Europe has affected what I call the lands in between, and particularly you might call the frontline states in this conflict. In some cases, it's an armed conflict, obviously, but for the most part, it's a sort of political war, or some people call it a special war, between Russia and the European Union. And my argument I'm going to make today is that the lands in between, in a way, are kind of unique. They have are unique in the respect to their vulnerability to Russian influence in particular. And I'm going to argue that that this has created a high salience of the conflict. The geopolitical struggle between Russia and the European Union has a particularly high salience in these countries. It is responsible for political cleavages. Political scientists in the room will remember Lipset and Rokan's argument about political cleavages often being generated by conflict. I'm going to argue that that's the case here. That this has led to increasing political polarization in lands in between, not only in Ukraine, but also in other of the countries of former Soviet Union that are sort of situated in between Europe and Russia. And then I'm going to emphasize that despite this Lipset and Rokan thesis more or less being true, right, and bearing out, there's a very interesting phenomenon that that the power brokers, the top leaders in many of these societies, have taken a role of power brokers and are actually balancing between both sides and actually profiting enormously by virtue of their ability to play both sides in this conflict. And they seem to be rather unique in that. And then I'm going to argue that that this type of politics actually has lessons not only for the lands in between, but is actually increasingly becoming the case in Central and Eastern Europe, in core Europe, and North America as well. And if I don't get quite to the end of that, because I've hit the 12-minute limit, then at least you'll know kind of what I was trying to say. So I'm going to skip quickly over this. There's a political war that Russia has launched against the EU. I think a lot of you are aware of that. There's many different aspects of it. I'm not going to get into that, but I have a whole part of the book where I talk about it. The EU, one part that's lesser known is that the EU has actually responded, I would argue, fairly strongly to this conflict in two respects. One is the sanctions everybody knows about, but another aspect people haven't quite talked very much about is the third energy package, which has been basically a way that the EU has tried to regulate the gas trade and energy trade between Russia and Europe in a way that's organized according to EU rules and therefore advantageous to the European Union, has basically been successful. So that's a unique sort of maybe contribution in this debate. I also want to argue that these responses, the strong responses that the EU has made to Russia, have further aggravated Russia. They haven't worked in the sense that, they've been working in the sense that they've had a response, but these responses haven't actually deterred Russia. If anything, they've only intensified the conflict. And that's why we see increasingly, I would say, risky action of Russia towards undermining elections in the West, for instance. However, the greatest impact of this struggle is felt in the lands in between. I probably also don't need to go too deeply into this because of time, but just to say that, you know, the post-Soviet states were rather late to pursue EU membership. They've been exceptionally vulnerable to Russian influence. You could look at this in military terms, in terms of bases, and I have a 2012 paper with David Cameron that looks at that, you know, placement of bases. Obviously, military interventions, frozen conflicts affecting Russia, Moldova, Georgia, exercises that affect Belarus recently. But also in terms of economics, the former Soviet states is probably pretty well known. Russia is the largest trading partner, and Russia has often used its position, its economic position vis-a-vis these countries to, in a political way, to sort of, when it's displeased with a country, to cut off trade. For instance, cutting off trade of Moldovan wine, imposing sort of a temporary ban on Ukrainian imports or sanctions on Ukraine, trading bans. And this has happened periodically and frequently. I give some examples in the paper, but you could go on for a very long list. Georgia. And then also culturally, Russia has a particular, unique position in that in many of these countries, because of the Russian imperial and Soviet legacy, there's a big Russian-speaking population, or just, you know, indigenous, a big Russian-speaking populations to which Russia can very easily speak via its propaganda methods, but also direct control over Orthodox Church in many of these countries, right? That enables Russian messages to be present on a weekly basis or daily basis from the most trusted institution in a number of these countries, or one of the most trusted institutions in a number of these countries. So the geopolitical divide also, I'm going to argue the political effects of this is that that in a number of these countries, and I believe this term is used frequently in Ukraine as well as Moldova, that people often talk about their countries as being, not always, but often, as being faced with a civilizational choice, right? That there's a perception that's grown in these countries that countries have to make a choice, and this is underlined by one of the books we're going to be talking about later today, between, you know, a sort of joining a kind of Russian zone, right, that is marked by a certain type of political economy and a certain type of culture and a certain type of politics, or joining a EU zone that has a totally different set of features in many of the main modes of organization of society. And because of this, there are very strong conflicts, cleavages in politics, because the conflict, in other words, is producing cleavages in politics, meaning that political parties and political actors typically have to identify as one or the other. And if you don't identify as one or the other, somebody else is going to identify you as one or the other. So it's pretty easy, in other words, I would argue, to code all the political parties in, say, Ukraine or Moldova as being pro-European or pro-Russian. They often do that themselves. And if they don't do that, then somebody else does it for them. And it's pretty hard to occupy a middle position. I would just give the example of opposition bloc. Opposition bloc in Ukraine seems to position itself kind of in the middle. But nobody, or very few people buy this, right? And it's a difficult problem for them. So you see an increasing polarization, particularly Ukraine. I'm going to talk specifically about Ukraine here, but it's same is true of other places, where polarization is increased through armed conflict. Nothing polarizes like an armed conflict. Parties and individuals are often forced to choose sides. Interestingly, in Ukraine, it appears that there's a conflation of national independence with the EU side. In other words, people tend to identify the fact that you want an independent Ukraine. That means you're on the pro-EU side, because obviously Russia has different ideas about this, and that's been a shift recently. And there's even political violence that breaks out between these sides, not only in the conflict zone, but I was visited Odessa recently, and in Odessa, there's actual political violence at a low level between these two different sides. This is some evidence that you probably have seen that of shifts in Ukrainian opinion. I can go back to that. The power brokers, so let me just get to this before I get cut off here, which is that interestingly, despite this increasingly polarized political climate in Ukraine, the people at the top of these societies tend to be on both sides. And I think there's an interesting reason for that. There's a very good paper by Stan Marcus and Charnish, which argues that oligarchs in general, in the Ukrainian case, typically do better when they stay behind the wings and support a multiplicity of political forces rather than committing to one public role. Their measure here was how wealthy they become. They become more wealthy if they stand behind the scenes and rather than taking on some sort of public role like governor. And interestingly, over time, Ukrainian oligarchs, this is my extension to their paper, most Ukrainian oligarchs have actually supported both the Yanukovych regime and the Poroshenko regime, and frankly, every other regime, right? Because the bottom line for the power brokers is that they want power, and they're not very concerned with these theoretical issues like Europeanness, right, or national issues like independence or mindset. They're much more concerned with, do they have money in the here and now, and do they fulfill their own projects? And therefore, they emphasize flexibility either at the same time or over time. They seek to profit, I'll just end with this slide. They seek to profit both from pro-Russia and pro-EU largesse. So in Moldova, for instance, there's cases of people who own pro-Russia television stations who position themselves as the most pro-EU politicians in the country and steal a lot of money from the EU in terms of loan and grant programs. Or examples, Plahotniuk in particular, people who run a pro-EU political party, but are also seen as the key sponsor of the pro-Russia political party. And through their own business dealings with both sides, manage to, if you think about it, there's money and incentives coming from both sides to be taken. And the people who are going to rise to the top are the people actually you take from both. And I would argue that that type of politics is actually increasingly visible also, not only in the lands in between, but increasingly in Central Europe with Orban or Trump or Berlusconi, and that increasingly all countries, involved in this conflict are exhibiting features of the lands in between.